All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Jiri. I'm the CEO and founder of Supernova IO, as you have heard. And thank you for a warm introduction. I probably don't really have much else to say because that was mostly everything that I wanted to say myself. So let's just dive deep into this presentation and to this talk. And it will be all about design systems and design system adoption. Now, the talk is two parts. I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting. So the first part, really just talking about the challenges that we encounter when we are building design systems. And then the second part, more practical one, we will build a design systems and we will build it using some of the new tools that maybe you have available now at your disposal. Now, before we dive, into all the problems that design systems inherently have and that products also have, because design systems are really products, I would like to start with a little bit of celebration of the design systems and maybe highlight why they are actually great. Because we as creators, both designers, developers, design ops, whoever is attending this conference, we know that design systems provide value to our users by what is it that actually gives this value. And I think it's great to sometimes stop and just listen to why they are amazing. So I've compiled this list of like top 5 6 things that I think are actually really important about design systems and why we ultimately try to make them. And this is what you see here. So starting with the consistency throughout our products, throughout our brands, it allows us to make products that are always the same. That it allows us to reuse a lot of stuff that we have created, ultimately cutting down the cost, the resources that we have to make available for building a product that we are building. And also sometimes it helps to onboard the new team members, right? If the new team members come to an environment where everything is in order, they can find the stuff and they can start right away. That certainly cheers them up, and I think it tells them that they've made a good decision joining, your company and maybe your design and development teams. And of course, all of this together makes for just happier teams altogether when it all clicks. Now, my question here is, if we spend a lot of time building a design systems, and polishing them, why is it that when we start distributing the design system and using the design system with our users, it usually looks like this? Our design systems actually fail to get traction, and not many users adopt them right away. And so you as a creator, you are really left wondering, like, where is everyone? Where is everyone who, I'm trying to convert, because this design system is clearly amazing and I've spent a lot of time building this. And in order to understand what are the problems, I would like to introduce you one concept that comes from a product environment, really, and it's called the chasm. Now, I would like to explain this on this concept on this illustration. Very nice illustration, if I can add this. And this is something that is called the innovation curve. Basically, what this describes is a behavior of your users, or really any user of a product, and how they adopt this product. Now, on the right side, you have innovators. On the left side, you have innovators. And innovators, it's people like creators who start with the design systems, people who like to create new stuff, who like new shiny stuff. And maybe you don't care as much about the value, really as much as of the technology itself. Now, going forward, you have early adopters, and those are the first users of your design system, and they are also cheering for you. They are really excited to get your design system going and also to use that design system. And those early adopters, they also really don't care about the value. They start to care a little bit, but if you have bugs, if you have some problems, maybe your documentation is not up to task, they still like to use this product and they will talk about it and they will tell the others. But now you are actually presented with probably the most prominent and the most difficult task, and that is crossing the chasm. It's really a term, crossing a chasm, and what it means is that you actually move from early adopters to early majority, which is where your design system or your product really gets attraction, right? It really starts to pick up the pace, and a lot of people are starting to adopt your product. Now, the difference between the early adopters and the early majority is that the early majority really cares about the value. They are maybe not that enthusiastic. They actually want this design system to provide them real value, so it speeds up what they are doing. And providing the value in succinct way, providing the value in a way where they understand and where there is not many bugs, where they can truly trust the design system or the product, that's actually really hard, which is why the chasm is actually the killer of the companies, of the startups, and also of the design systems, because it's just this huge gap that you have to overcome that contains many and many obstacles, and we'll talk about this going forward in the talk. And of course, the second half of this curve is the late majority and the laggards. It's the users who will only adopt if certain amount of people in your company adopt it, and it will be more about social pressure rather than trying to use something new. So now that we understand what the chasm is, it is important to talk in relation to a design system, why the people are actually scared of this chasm. And I personally have run hundreds of interviews, demos to clients, have been talking with a lot of people because design systems are my passion. I'm also a developer, so I'm sort of lazy by nature and I try to do a lot of automation. So it's a topic that I really care the most about. And I've compiled this list of like 5 major areas that I would like to share with you that I think are the biggest blockers that basically prevent you from crossing this chasm. And I would like to start with point number 1, which is that when we start to build a design system, most of the times or sometimes we ignore existing work, we ignore existing tools and processes. Now, design systems, they don't exist in a vacuum, right? It's a sophisticated tool, it's a sophisticated product that should help a lot of people across different departments. So it should help the designers, it should help the developers. But if we try to build a design system in a vacuum, if we don't take into account maybe what the company is doing in terms of processes and technologies that they are using, it simply doesn't work. And I would like to explain this on this picture. Now, imagine this tree to be your design system, and everything around it is the ecosystem, right? But as you can see, this tree basically grew without the ecosystem, and so it's very bleak. You can say that if there is a lightning bolt, it will just catch on fire and it will probably die. And it's the same with the design systems. If you don't have the ecosystem around the design system, it will really not scale, and it will not be adopted by anyone other than the basically the people before the chasm. You need to take the ecosystem into the account. Now, of course, if we build a design system that is supported by the company, by the developers, by the designers, then you can think about it as a lush forest, right? It will have the protection. It will also have the nurture. So the design system itself will actually grow. And it is very important because this ecosystem is what will ultimately provide us the resources to grow and scale the design system. Now, about the point 2, which is outdated, incomplete, and invisible information. I've said that in order to cross the chasm, you actually need to provide value to the users, right? It has to be a real value. But it's also about that people trust your design system. Because you can think about design system as something that is a relationship, really. It takes a lot of time for developers and for designers to trust a new technology or a new design system, new platform that they should be using. But it actually takes considerably less time to abandon this, because if it just leaves a bad impression, if there are some bugs, maybe the information is outdated and so on, then it will simply not be interesting to them, and they will probably resort to doing stuff manually, which is definitely something that we have to avoid. Now, what really helps us is that people by nature are curious. So they will give it this initial shot, they will try to this design system, and they will actually judge whether there is value or not for them. But if there isn't, then they will leave, of course. Now, one thing that I've noticed is that, and it is something that we don't talk as a designers and developers and design ops nearly as much, is that people do actually put a lot of trust to your hands by just using whatever you have created. And I can give you an example from practice. Um, let's call this person a Joe, and this Joe has created a feature, and this feature was using a design system, right? And it was fine. It went through QA, and then it was released. And sometime after the release, the feature actually broke. And it broke because something in the design system, some component, was actually broken, but somehow it got through the system. Now, ultimately, it damaged the company, and the Joe was fired. And it wasn't because, it wasn't because he did a good job. It was because the design system had a flaw that they didn't know, and maybe wasn't documented, and so on. And so it is very important to understand that because they are using our design system, it ultimately affects what they are doing in I would say very intimate fashion, and of course it can ultimately make them lose their job. It is a bit absurd story. Usually it would not happen like this, but you can see how this would be possible. Now, point number three about why the adoption is actually hard is that we usually don't have resources. We as the creators of the design systems, we usually don't have resources for sophisticated tooling. Now, design systems are not just about design tokens or components or the documentation. It is about the ecosystem. And that means that you have to sort of be integrated with this design, with this ecosystem. And if you are starting a design system, you will make a lot of considerations about how exactly your design system will look like, what will be the scope, and of course, what areas it will touch and maybe what areas it will automate. And you only really have two options when you are starting a design system. You can either take a existing design system and basically customize it. Let's say you want to use Material UI or Carbon from IBM, then you would start with this and you would customize it to your needs. Now, the problem with customization like this is it is not very flexible, right? The design system was already built on top of certain tooling. It made certain decisions. And when you basically adopt it, it really starts in a vacuum. So you still have to spend a lot of resources to adopt it to your company. Now, there is second option, and I think a lot of people will actually start with this, and that is building your own custom tooling solution. That means maybe the design tokens, as you've heard about in the last presentation, maybe a delivery of them, maybe converting them to a CSS or exporting images. All of this is actually something that you have to build as a custom tooling, or maybe use some open source. Again, this is very costly. And at the beginning, when you are a single person, basically, it's usually impossible to get enough resources to build something more sophisticated. So you are really only left with not a really great choice, and that is to manually manage your design systems. Now, the problem with manual management of the design system is that if you it actually ties with the point that we have been making, that the incomplete and outdated information are not exactly the greatest, because they undermine the value, but also they undermine the trust of the users in your design system. So the manual management actually makes this a little bit more problematic, because let's say you change a color in Figma or in Sketch and you would like to propagate this information throughout the entire system, but if there is no tooling in a place, then this will not happen and you will have to do all of this manually. And of course, if you do it hundreds of times, there is a high chance that you've made something wrong because you simply don't remember everything, right? We are only humans. So manual management, not the greatest way, but most often, or oftentimes, I would say, something that people resort to because there is simply no other choice. And so you are left with this catch 22, where you basically need the resources, the initial resources, to prove that you are giving out the value to get the more resources. So it's very hard to start with the design systems in this regard. Now, I would like to read you something, and that is basically a quote from this article that I've been reading the other day. And that is: the experiments by Princeton psychologists reveal that all it takes is a tenth of a second to form an impression of a stranger from their face. Now, this article, this psychological study, was released in July issue of Psychological Science. It is very well-known study. And what it basically tells you is that first impressions matter. Like, you already formed an impression of me, and I hope that it is a positive impression, but you certainly have one. It is because we as humans do it subconsciously, and whether it's tenth of the second or 7 seconds or 15 doesn't really matter. In terms of design systems, you truly have only very short a period of time to actually engage with your users and to tell them that they are looking at something that is amazing. Now, this ties to a fourth point, which is not enough provided or perceived value. You as creators, you know that there is value in the design system. You have built this design system, and maybe it contains tokens and maybe it contains components, and you have documented it well. But sometimes, and oftentimes, what happens is that the value is only known to you and maybe the inner circle, the people before the chasm, because we are not conveying the value properly. It takes a great deal of effort, I would say, to actually make a documentation that is fully up to date with everything. All the components are documented and so on. So yeah, it just takes a lot of time. Now the value is of course diminished further if the delivery of the design system is cumbersome, and that ties to a third point, which is usually not having enough resources for a sophisticated tooling. Sometimes, especially when you really want to get a lot more resources, people forget that the design systems are also, because they are a product, they also need to provide value in terms of the business. And so we as designers and we as developers, we sometimes neglect this, that we forget to explain the business value, but I do think this is extremely important. So just like a word of advice, if you want to get the design system approved or off the ground, really make a business case for it. Just explain how we can save 30% of the resources on the development. Features can be built faster, maybe add a little bit of human touch into it, that you will be onboarding your team members faster and so on. It really makes for a compelling case. And lastly, of course, if we don't have a good tooling, then maybe we are missing some features that would turn a good design system into a great one. If you see some of the design systems that the most prominent brands have created, they usually have something special, and that specialty usually takes time. So, of course, a regular design system will not have that at the beginning, but it is something that that humans usually love, and that they will see as perceived value. Now, for the last point, it is something that is really hard to explain, but it's basically a missing oomph. or missing the soul. Design systems sometimes have problem in that they are really just a bunch of documentation that doesn't really look nice. So you can see this in the comparison of those two images. On the left side, you see Sprout's Socials design system, which is a really nice, colorful design system. And then on the right side, you will see just something that was written in Storybook. Now, both of them provide a great value, but actually, you will always probably say the design system on the left feels like it is more mature, right? It is more involved because there was clearly a lot of effort put into it. So now we have explained all the problems with the design systems, and it may sound like it's pretty bleak with the design systems and that it takes really a lot of effort, and it does, but it's clearly possible to create the design systems that adopt really well. And here are some examples of some design systems that people created, like the Salesforce Lightning, Fluent Polaris, or Carbon from IBM, that clearly are a pinnacle of the design system and that are used throughout the entire company. So it was fully adopted. And you can argue that those are large companies, but there are also hundreds of examples of others from smaller companies that made it. So it's clearly somehow possible. So what is this? What is it that the best design systems have in common? Now, in my opinion, it is basically an answer to all of those questions. Right? So one by one, they clearly present and deliver value, and they truly wow you in the first few seconds. You just see the design system and you say, okay, this is amazing. And then you dive deeper, but there was this initial hook into the design system. Now they blend information from multiple departments, so they treat designers and developers equally, and this is very hard to do, especially if the tooling doesn't allow you to do something like this. And they need to integrate with the company toolchains. So if you have this ecosystem that I was talking about, the design system just feels like a natural part of it. They are always up to date. If you look at Material UI, you will see that there are hundreds of versions, for example, and the documentation always fits this design system and its latest version. And it adds some additional value, and this is what I was saying as a point 4, that there is always something special. And finally, it is a product of a collaboration. So everyone in the company can go into the design system and they will see some value, be it the designer, be it the developer, or even product owners. Now, I was talking about all of this because I want to introduce you to a new concept that we have been exploring in Supernova, and that is something that we call design system as a service. We want to basically make it possible to people to use the power tools that only the large companies have available to build your design system so it feels like a natural part of your ecosystem. And I would like to give you a short demo. So let me just share my screen really quickly and let's get to it. Now in this demo, we will build a design system and we will start from scratch, and the ultimate goal is basically to have everything documented, the components, tokens, maybe some assets so you can download the images and so on. And because we really only have, say, 10 minutes, we should be very quick about it. So let's get started. I do have a Figma file here. And in this Figma file, my designer created a lot of colorful palettes that I would like to use and maybe give to the developers. So I also have some icons, some components that I have created. Now, what I will do as a first thing is I will copy this link to a file and go to Supernova, which is a cloud platform that has all those power tools that you can start using right away. Now, if we switch to a Figma tab, I will just link the Figma file, copy paste the link. And what will happen is we will basically start importing the data from Figma, which means everything that you have in your design systems: tokens, components, assets, even fonts, if you are using some fonts that are not default by the system. Now the import has finished, so you can see that we have some components available now and some tokens. And now, after the last presentation, you know everything about the tokens, so we can actually build on that, and we can dive a little bit more into those. So when I've imported, you can see that the content of a Figma file here is actually now available to me in Supernova, and I have all those color palettes beautifully represented here. Now, design systems are not just about design, right? They are also about code, and in many cases, they are primarily about code and code components. So I would like to start just by maybe adding some like developer-oriented token, because this is clearly just coming from Figma, but developers also have their own definitions that they would like to have. So maybe I will create a border, something that you cannot do in Figma, call it a developer token, and I will maybe use a color from already existing colors. So then every time this color would change, this border token would also change. 1 pixel sounds good. I will create this token, and now you can see that I have a developer border token. That's great. Going forward to components, we have imported the components, and you can see that not only they are components, they are also assets, so I would be able to download them. Now, in terms of components, we also need the code for the component, and we will do this inside the documentation. Because sometimes, and in many cases, the documentation is actually the design system, right? People think about documentation as something that they will be basically selling, giving to the users. So we will use all of this that we have imported, and also all of this that we have created in terms of the border tokens inside the documentation. So I will now leave the components as they are and switch to the documentation. We will build all of this there. So I will just edit docs, and now you'll see that we have this nice documentation editor that works and feels like Notion. In fact, you can actually see that if I would like to add a header, for example, you can select from several blocks that we have available. Now, what this documentation editor allows us to do, however, is to connect stuff that we have imported, be it from the design side or from the developer side, to the documentation. So in my first page, you can see that I have an introduction, and it's my Supernova documentation. And you can see that I have listed that I want my core brand here. Now, if I write a token here, you can see that I have a list or detail or groups of tokens available. So maybe let's use a list. So I just can use whatever I created, and maybe let's say that our core brand is the ugly green, and then the blue one, and maybe the aquatic one. Now I can publish my documentation, and now every time there is you can see that this is actually connected to Figma. So every time this changes in Figma, this token would also actually change. So let's say we do a rebrand, instead of just going into the documentation, it will propagate automatically. And this goes for all the elements that I have here. Now, if I view the documentation, you will see that indeed we have the introduction page, but now we have our nice core brand colors, maybe with hex representations, maybe with RGB, but those are dynamic colors, so they will change anytime the source changes. And the source can be Figma, but it can also be code. So let's continue, and let's maybe add more tokens. Let's maybe visualize them in nice, colorful way. So I'll again use a token block, but this time I will use a group. I'll select the color and maybe use the blue color. And now you can see that I have a list of colors. And again, they are all connected to Figma. So anytime I change something in Figma, everything will change. If I add a new token or delete a new token or delete some existing token, this list would also change. So again, let's republish this, and we can look how this is represented inside the documentation. Let's just wait for the deployment a little bit. And while we are doing this, we can also add maybe some assets. So I'll just add a asset block, which is basically the ability to render certain specific icons from my design system, maybe again coming from Figma. And I will maybe use all of my icons, or actually maybe even just in one resolution. And now you can see that we have icons here as well. And our developers and our designers from the documentation side would be able to download those icons and use them in their code bases. We do have some other means of delivery, but we'll get to this in a few moments. Now, switching to components, this is where the fun begins, because components usually, so far we have been talking about Figma and about design tools, right? But I've also created something that is specific to Supernova. But button usually means I need to represent some code, and maybe I also need a visualization of this button. And maybe I also have some other sources of the data. For example, my developers maybe are using different documentation that they want to use and that they want to show in this documentation side. So very quickly, what I will do, I will pull from different sources, from a GitHub and then also from some Excel sheet that you will see, to just construct a button that looks and feels like a real documentation page for a button. Now, starting with this button, I would like to have an example of the button that is ideally live. So what I can do, I can actually write a render React code or actually any web code. And I have an example here that I've coded before this presentation. And if I copy paste this, you will see that we have actually rendered a React code live inside this documentation. So this all basically allows me to pull from a different sources, from a developer libraries, and also maybe from different documentations, as you will see. Now, I want to add a description of this button, and the description was already written by my developers. It is in this nice, in a GitHub, but it is nicely documented in this Markdown file. So what I can do with Supernova as well is I can take this raw content and I can just add a Markdown here. And we can pull from this different source or from this remote source every time you publish a documentation. So you can actually continue editing this documentation, or your developers can continue editing this documentation inside this Markdown file, but it will always feel and look like our documentation because it will become a part of it. So let's maybe just write properties, have it nicely documented. We convert it to a header and we republish this. And what will happen is it will construct all of this. It will basically make it into a one single documentation. And then when I switch to components, you can see that I have indeed a page of a button. This is live code, so it looks and feels like a real component. And this is a markdown that is coming from a different source, from the raw source of the GitHub, but it's actually part of our documentation. So right now we have created a page where we have our core brand, we have our tokens as a palette, as a list, basically, with maybe some extra information. We also have all the assets and we can download them. And we have the component. So now it feels and looks like a documentation and it pulls from all the different sources. But I do have one more thing that I want to show you, and that is, design systems are all about customization, I would say. Design systems should feel like your own design system, or a documentation should feel like your own design system. And so with Supernova, we've added this ability because we know that everyone likes to customize stuff heavily. We've added this ability where you can basically use a different frontend for your documentation. which means that you can not only change the layout information, or the coloring, but you can actually change the entire functionality of how your front end of the documentation looks like. So you can add power tools that right now were only available to some specific companies because they've spent a lot of time building a custom toolchain. And to explain you how exactly this works, I have this design system, Sprout Social. If you are into design systems, you definitely know it, and I really like how it looks like. So what I have created before this demo is something that we call exporter. Now, exporter is a package that basically defines a front end and also can contribute additional functionality to the documentation. Now, the front end is basically a template, so you can change the template in any way as you like. And I will show you exactly this. So you can see that I have the Seeds design system, which is the Sprout Seeds social design system. If I switch this, it says the active exporter is now Seeds design system. If we republish this documentation, then we will basically re-render the entire documentation using the same data, again, pulling from all the sources, but giving it basically a different look and feel, and maybe also a different functionality. So if I just reload this page, you will see that the entire documentation has changed, and it now looks and feels exactly as the Sprouts social design system. I've went to a great length to make it exactly like this. Now, not only it contributes a function, it contributes the design, but it also contributes the functionality. I was telling you that there is this one nice thing about every design system that they've created and specifically handcrafted for this design system. And I think for the Sprout Social is this badge. It shows you whether the component is healthy or not, and it has this nice overlay. So I will use the same. As I said, the exporters can also contribute the functionality. So now when I'm using the Sprout Social exporter or the template really, I have some new blocks available to me, and you can see that one of them is dynamic health. If I add this and I write a button here, what it does is that when I publish, it will connect to this Excel spreadsheet that I have created beforehand, fetches the button just using a plain JavaScript, basically fetches all the information and checks whether it's healthy or not. The documentation was published. So if we refresh this documentation, you can now see that in our documentation, it also says that this button is healthy. We have live code and we have all the properties. So with using basically a service like Supernova, which is really a design system as a service, you get access to all of those power tools, but you can still use, your ecosystem that you have created in terms of processes, in terms of the data that you have available, and there is much more that goes into Supernova. You can visit it at supernova.io if you want to know more, or you can just ping me and Jiri at supernova.io. But I would very much like to give you a space to ask some questions and have a little bit of talk about what we have seen and maybe discuss the adoption a little bit more.